My name is Sara Tiffany, and I'm here with my colleague, Emily Buere. We work for the Community Alliance with Family Farmers. We're a California statewide nonprofit that's based up in Davis, but we have projects going on all over the place. Generally speaking, we've been working for over 40 years to really push forward sustainability in our food systems and our farming systems. Our primary sort of beneficiaries are small-scale family farmers all over California. And so we're here in particular to talk about our Climate Smart Farming program, which Emily and I work on. And in particular to talk about our work in intensive no-till systems. And you heard about this yesterday morning if you're here for Elizabeth Kaiser's talk, somewhat familiar. So we're going to be digging into a project that we've been working on with them at their farm as well as a number of other farms here. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about, we define climate smart farming as really any system of farming or farming practices that have the ability to mitigate and adapt to climate change through greenhouse gas reductions, through sequestering carbon, through conservation of natural resources like topsoil and water, and also through improving resilience to things like drought and extreme weather events. And one thing I always like to kind of remind folks is that a lot of this conversation centers around carbon, as it should, but there's actually a lot of really important angles to climate smart farming, whether you're talking about reducing nitrous oxide emissions that have 300 times the equivalence of CO2 in terms of global warming potential, which you can do just by improving your fertilizer and irrigation efficiency, or whether you're just talking about better water management on your farm. It can make huge differences both in gases coming off your farm and just in keeping our natural resources where they should be. So just a reminder, there's a lot of tools in the toolbox to climate smart farming.
Okay. Hi everyone. Are you guys all able to hear me okay? Yeah, okay. All right, is that better? Okay. So climate smart farming really highlights the nexus between climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as farm productivity and resilience, and also the conservation of natural resources. So for example, just by increasing the soil organic matter in the soil, we are able to see really good results such as increased yields on farms. We're able to see better water use efficiency through greater water holding capacity in the soil, as well as better water infiltration rates in the soil. We can also see that there is often better resistance to pests and diseases and greater resiliency for these farms to extreme weather events such as droughts and flooding, and also, of course, mitigation to climate change. And so Sara and I were just talking recently actually with a farmer about how crazy it is kind of that he's the third generation farming in his family, and he's essentially trying to convince his father to go back to farming the way that his grandfather had really before the influx of all these agrochemicals into the system. And so I think this really goes to show that some of these practices that we're going to be talking about really are not necessarily new. Many of them are rooted in traditional knowledge. And so some of the tools, I think the tools that we have today and the technology that we have today, along with this knowledge from the past, can really be paired well together, and that we have this really unique opportunity right now as agriculture is now being known and awareness is being increased around agriculture as being a powerful tool for climate adaptation and mitigation. So here's just a handful of some of the practices that we talk about when we are talking about climate smart farming. So for example, the implementation of cover crops, hedgerows, crop rotation, the use of compost, and there's really a great number of benefits that we can see as well. So for example, reduced nitrate leaching, even better yields and higher productivity. And I think it's important to note here also that just in terms of terminology, really there's a lot of overlap here with terms like regenerative agriculture or carbon farming or soil health, you can call it. And really it doesn't matter to us too much what it's called, just as long as farmers are able to actually implement these practices and see results, then we're happy with that.
Yeah, and just to kind of give you an idea of our approach to our climate smart farming project, we have 3 aspects of our program. I would say first and foremost, it's about farmer knowledge. CAFF is a really old, in the scheme of nonprofit in agriculture in California, and it really came from a group of small-scale organic farmers back in the 70s that didn't feel that they were represented properly by, or at all, by the Farm Bureau. So, you know, this is really a grassroots organization that started in the 70s, and I think since then we've really tried to elevate the farmer's voice as best we can in terms of especially small-scale family farmers that are becoming fewer and fewer in California. So we work a lot just with farmers, building farmer-to-farmer connections through all these different projects. We do a good amount of on-farm demonstrations and research projects, one of which we're going to talk about today. And we do a number of them. They're kind of based on what the knowledge gaps are, what the opportunities are, what the interests of the farmers are. Currently, we're running projects in integrated crop livestock systems, where we're looking at closing the loop and bringing livestock back into our cropping systems, whether you're talking about vineyards or nut orchards or even into crop rotations. And we also have a project in cover cropping. We do a lot of projects in cover cropping all over California, in part because there's a ton of interest right now, both among conventional farmers and organic farmers, and it's a really important bridge practice that has huge potential in terms of actually having feasible, really high adoption rates in California. And lastly, in terms of our on-farm research projects, we have this intensive no-till system project that we've been working with Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser on, as well as a number of other farms. So the gist of those projects is really to work directly with farmers, usually a handful of farmers at a time, figure out what their priorities are, what they want to do, what's feasible in their management system, and work with them to implement a new practice or a new farming system and follow their experience along the way, as well as monitoring the soil health and its response to a new practice or a new farming system. And we try to really put those two things together to better understand what's going on the farm and also optimize the implementation of any new practice or farming system, because ultimately there's so many different ways of farming, and what we really need, I think, is to bring together the tools we have in science with the farmer knowledge to really optimize the effects there. The last thing I did just want to mention is that our program, and also CAFF in general, does a lot of policy advocacy, really trying to ensure that agriculture largely, and especially small-scale family farms, are included as part of the solution when it comes to climate change mitigation policy and adaptation. So a lot of interesting conversations happening these days in Sacramento, which we're part of, and I'm hoping that we're going to see some really good policy coming down the pipeline here. So just, I want to give you guys a quick background, just kind of why we started out on the no-till, the intensive no-till project in particular. It was really as a result of trying to figure out different kinds of answers to this question. So how can we do more with less land while having a positive effect rather than a negative effect on their natural resources and our climate, while also providing economic opportunities for farmers that don't have a lot of access to land and capital? So seemingly kind of a tall ask in the agricultural system that we all have in California and across the world. But we really do think there are solutions here and a lot of opportunities. And once we started learning about Singing Frogs Farm and the success they've had and all of the people they've trained over the years, we started really asking ourselves, well, would this work in other places, on other farms, in other climates, on other soils, and what would it look like? So that's kind of our entry point there. And, you know, and the more we learned about it, we really, it became very evident there's also a huge, there's a huge knowledge gap. There's almost no research on intensive no-till systems that aren't of the very large scales we see in the Midwest. There's tons of research there. But we're talking about farms that are 2 acres or less and making their entire livelihood on that land. So very few actual research studies on there. No one's really looking at some, you know, what I think are really interesting topics in terms of what's happening in the soil with that amount of productivity we see. And the other thing that we saw is there's a really interesting connection when you talk about intensive no-till systems between urban farmers and rural farmers. Emily's going to mention this later, but you know, if you get a group of farmers in the room to talk about this type of farming system, the different practices that are involved, the different adaptations people have, who is in that room is extremely diverse. You have folks that are farming in the Bay Area. Did any of you make it out to the Oxford tract in Berkeley? A few of you guys? So there's a field day on Sunday for the conference at the Oxford tract. So, you know, there's a ton of urban farming that is implementing this type of farming system as well as rural farming. And it's so cool to get these populations together in a room and have that not be the conversation. It's not about their differences or the differences in their markets or this or that. It's all about the practices and what they're seeing and how they can do it more.
So before we start to really look at some of this data that we took as far as our soil samples, let's first lay out some of the concepts that really guide this, this system of intensive no-till. So really, as Sara mentioned, we got together with a group of urban and rural farmers, and we partnered with UC Berkeley and Mesa to have a meeting and a discussion with these farmers around what intensive no-till really looks like. And we found that there were actually quite a few more people that were interested in this conversation that we anticipated, so that's really a good sign. And so out of this conversation, we came up with a number of different guiding principles that really guide the practices. So for example, we see that there's a minimization of soil disturbance, there's a maximization of crop density, both spatially and temporally or seasonally. There's also a maximization of on-farm biodiversity, and then we can also use soil carbon as a tool to mitigate climate change. And so there's really a number of different practices that can be used in this type of system, and these are just a handful of the ones that we really identified as being more common. So for example, polyculture, which I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with. So Elizabeth Kaiser gave a really good example of this yesterday, that at Singing Frogs, they will basically double crop their lettuce and their cauliflower. And that's a really excellent way to basically utilize the differing architectures and the differing needs of these plants and the ways that they mature in the same space, and to really maximize productivity of that space. And also in terms of rotations, we see that these are really intensively managed. So for example, again, at Singing Frogs, what they'll do is they will, in their greenhouse, grow up a number of starts to a pretty good size, so that as soon as they harvest, they're ready right away to just plant right in there. They don't leave the soil bare. And so seasonally as well, they're also able to keep things in the ground. And then in terms of what's actually being planted, this is also a really good way to build biodiversity into the system. So for example, rather than planting in, a brassica and then follow that with another brassica, we would see another family being planted in. And so since there's actually differences in these species and varieties slightly between the types of root exudates, we see that the soil microbial diversity is also maximized as well. So that can be really good for combating pests and diseases. And then we also see that with continuous ground cover, so for example, obviously having crops in the ground as much as possible, but then also keeping the ground covered with cover crops or with mulches, or some of the farms that we've worked with also use occultation, which is basically using a black plastic reusable tarp that goes down on the soil, and that's largely to help with weed control. But really all of these methods go to keeping the soil surface protected, and that the microbes and the biodiversity happy, and also just continuing to build the organic matter. And then lastly, another common practice is composting. So typically compost will be applied to just the very top soil, or in some cases with one of the farms that we work with, they'll actually lightly incorporate it into the top inch or so. So really it would seem that these practices are pretty clear cut and straightforward, but I think it's also worth noting that there's really almost an infinite number of ways that they can be implemented on any one unique farm. So this also allows for a certain amount of flexibility and adaptability for this type of system. And also seeing that, land access is a pretty huge issue, especially for beginning farmers. Being able to have a type of system that is highly productive per unit of land is very important. And also being able to, produce land, if you don't have access to a lot of machinery, but you do have access to labor, then this is, it fits really nicely in that way. And so altogether, we see that this type of system tends to be more accessible, especially for beginning farmers, and it can be more equitable as well.
So just briefly, the kind of structure of our project here is we started working on this project in 2017, starting out with the farms that are involved in the project, going to Singing Frogs Farm for a farmer-to-farmer training, and then going back to their own farms and adapting what they learned to their land. And this was a really important part of the process, and saying that no one's going to replicate another person's farm. You take the nuts and bolts, you take your own knowledge, you take the conditions of your land, and you do your best here, and we're going to learn along the way. So in addition to that, as I mentioned, starting in 2017, before these farms, especially the ones that started no-till for the first time, we took baseline soil samples, followed by 3 years of resampling. And we all also are doing a cost study with Singing Frogs Farm to really look into the details of the economic trade-offs and opportunities associated with this style of farming.
So the farms that we worked with, as Sara mentioned, there's 4 farms, so Singing Frogs is one of them, and they really ranged in size and from being quite small to less than 1 acre to up to about 10 acres. There's also a pretty good variety in terms of the soils and the climates, being that they're in different areas of Northern California. So the first one, Singing Frogs Farm, really served as our model farm, as Sara mentioned, and the other 3 farms in our project were able to visit Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser's farm, really learn directly from them and learn these methods. And so Singing Frogs, if some of you aren't familiar, they're a diversified small-scale vegetable farm in Sebastopol. And really their soil has this incredible tilth because the soil organic matter is so high. They don't even need to broad fork it anymore. And that's also translated for them to really good yields and high productivity. So our other partner is Soil Born Farms, which is in Sacramento. And they are a certified organic diversified vegetable farm. They have a really robust outreach and youth education program as well. And then we have Hillview Farms, which is Lincoln, so that's about an hour east of Sacramento in the foothills. And since they're in the foothills, they have a really good amount of variety of soil just within their fields. So that poses some interesting management challenges, I think, for them. But they actually started out as a small-scale urban farm, and were completely no-till, and that model worked really nicely for them, and they were able to build their business really quite quickly. And 5 years ago, they were able to procure a slightly larger piece of land. Now they're farming on 2 acres that they actually have in production. And now they are they're reduced till now. So basically they will work the top inch or two of the soil, but they're not inverting it. So it's really been interesting to see that this is just a different kind of adaptation or iteration of this kind of system. And it's worked really well for them considering that they don't have a lot of labor available. And then Fresno Metro Ministry is a nonprofit that is in West Fresno, and they are looking to get started with an urban agriculture and community garden program. And being that they're on city land, they've had a fair amount of challenges due to red tape, just being able to break ground. So it looks like, fortunately, this fall they're going to be able to do that and really get started, and we'll be able to start the process with them. But one thing that's unique about them is that they work quite a bit with the Hmong and Latinx community there in West Fresno, and actually they brought a group of Hmong farmers to Singing Frogs Farm, and they were really very enthusiastic about this style of farming because it's quite similar to the way that they would farm in Southeast Asia, because there's, it relies largely on labor and it's not heavily mechanized. So we're happy to see that this group is very dedicated to this project, and there's going to be a really big element of the community engagement, I think, with this group in particular.
Yeah, so just to kind of get into what we're looking at in the soils. So again, I do want to emphasize that there's really no academic research on systems like this, which I think people are starting to sort of wake up and smell the coffee because it really is very interesting. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on. UC Berkeley is working on a project. Cornell's done one study. UC Santa Cruz is maybe going to get into it. So what we're doing, as I mentioned, we're doing baseline sampling plus 3 years. So next year, 2020 in the spring, is actually our last sampling for this project. And we have, a pretty rigorous split block design just to make sure our data is really sound. We have controls wherever they're possible. There are certain sites that are just doing no-till on the whole thing, so there aren't always controls, but we have a lot of replications kind of to account for all the different variations that we see. We're sampling down to 2 feet, which is very intentional. We're of course interested in building up organic matter and carbon in the top few inches of the soil, but what we really want to know is what's happening to that carbon. Is it moving? If carbon is just in the top of the soil and it's not deeper at all, your likelihood of long-term carbon sequestration is not very high. And so we're looking at different depths, and we're actually splitting it into 3 depths. So we look at the top 6 inches, 6 to 12 inches, and then 12 inches to 24. So Emily and I have very strong backs, we'll put it that way. A few of the things we're looking at a few different kinds of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Those are all 3 of those really important in carbon sequestration. You need more than carbon to sequester carbon. Good thing to remember. pH, cation exchange capacity, bulk density, and also microbial ecology. And I'll go over a few of those things. Before I do dig into any of the numbers, I just threw this up as a placeholder, but I just wanted to tell you about some of the things we expected to see. So you guys may remember, but that graphic that Emily had that had all those different climate smart practices, and in the center it said ecological farming systems. So climate smart farming practices they're entry points, right? If you're, a conventional farmer, for example, but you're interested in maybe turning the corner, you'll start with one thing. Maybe it's compost, maybe it's cover crops, something like that. And then you get to work with farms along the way, and hopefully farms that are, we'll say a bit more open to the kind of integration that they want to do. And you'll see more and more practices being integrated and stacked on top of each other. And when you integrate those practices to a higher and higher degree, you see these synergies that actually where the benefits are higher than they would be of any singular practice, and then adding those together. So when we talk about intensive no-till and we're combining minimal soil disturbance with the soil always being covered, which moderates the temperature and moderates the moisture. Combining that with organic material constantly going into the soil through mulch, through compost, through plant roots, through crop residue, those three things happening all of the time, you see this really dynamic synergy happening with the carbon, the nutrient cycling, the water cycling, way more things than we can possibly measure, to be honest. But one of the things that I've been most interested in is, I don't know if you can see, but there's a little root channel here with, I don't know if I have a pointer. Nope. But it's of carbon moving down the root channels, right? So one of the beautiful things we see in these soils is this incredible soil structure. So this is my soil nerd coming out, by the way. This incredible soil structure, you see the soil color changing down to 2 feet. And you think to yourself, you know, everybody's looking at measuring their soils the top 6 inches. But if we're serious about carbon sequestration, we need to go way deeper than that. So what we see with these enhanced nutrient cyclings, the soil structure, we see a movement of the carbon going down in the form of dissolved organic carbon. And that's one of the things we're most interested in addition to all of these different indicators like how much you're able to increase your microbial biomass. We're also looking at measurements like predator-prey populations in the microbes. There's a test that we have done that is actually testing the stress of the microbial community and what they can handle, right? So these are questions that we want to know when we're asking about resilience to drought, resilience to flooding, resilience to all kinds of things we probably can't even anticipate. So a lot going on in the soil here. And as I mentioned, this is all sort of, you know, this is the science behind the practices that we're very interested in. And we have a little bit of data to share. Unfortunately, we didn't end up getting it all for today, but we have a couple huge indicators. And I want to start with total microbial biomass because, you know, microbes are really running the show when it comes to carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling, soil structure, all of these things. They're really running the show. And total microbial biomass is really an excellent indicator of the life of your soil, right? You can't build a healthy soil without building a microbial community in your soil. There's nuance there in terms of how efficient those microbes are, how much CO2 they respire versus how much CO2 they're sequestering. But across the board, without improving your microbial biomass, you're not going to increase your carbon. Because organic matter, which I should mention, by the way, so we're talking about carbon a lot. So we're talking about organic carbon, which is a little bit more than half of organic matter, which is a more familiar term. So organic matter by itself is made up of 50 to 80% of microbes, dead and alive. That's what organic matter is. So without them, we're not going to get the job done. So what you're seeing behind me is 3 of the farms we're working with. Singing Frogs is over here on your right. And if you look, I'll go on this side maybe. So the yellow bars here that we have going on are from their no-till fields. And the control at Singing Frogs actually is their neighbor, which is not a farm, it's a perennial grassland. So put that in your minds. We're actually comparing their farming system to a neighbor that has the native soil that Singing Frog started with that has perennial grasses year-round. So in the control, there's constant carbon input, there's constant cover, and there's no disturbance. So the fact that Singing Frogs has those numbers that are so much higher than the control, which is pretty much a native ecosystem, is just astounding, right? And I should say we're actually, for Singing Frogs, we're actually sampling 2 of their no-till fields, and this is aggregated data. So there's a lot of data wrapped up in these figures. And so we weren't able to start singing frogs on soil sampling until 2018, but since they've been doing this for 10 years, we figured there was no big rush. But having 2 years of data, we're going to have 3. The trends are just really, really strong. The next one I want to jump to is soil-borne farms. So this, I would say, this is what we see when we have big obstacles to intensive no-till systems. We have a soil that is really pretty low in organic matter, does not have a lot of biological activity, so they're getting a slow start. And you'll see in this middle figure with soil-borne farms, the control microbial biomass is actually higher than in the intensive no-till system. Couple of reasons for that. One, they grew cover crops in their control, which we found out a bit after the fact, so it is not in fact a very good control, because there was no control, there was no cover crops in the intensive no-till, so just right from the start of it, they had a healthier soil starting in their control field, basically. So we're seeing some of that. And in 2019, that cover crop had just been tilled when we sampled, basically. So you see some effects there. But I did want to include this graph because I want to illustrate how difficult it is to implement a farm like this that has been tilled and tilled and tilled, right? So to convert to no-till from being a sort of a conventional till, though this is a certified organic farm, it's a challenge, right? There's a lot of obstacles. And there's, you have weed problems that you never could have imagined before. Bindweed practically swallowing interns, right? You gotta do all kind, and in the mind there's thinking, well, if I just got the disc out, I could just take care of it real quick, right? So very challenging. But we're still really hopeful, and they're super excited about this project. And actually, even though the data's not there, they've already expanded this to new fields. So they think they're seeing something. And then lastly, over here on the left, we have Hillview Farms, which is, to confess, I don't want to play favorites, but one of my favorite farms to work with. And they actually, starting in 2017, they'd been practicing intensive no-till for 2 years. So really, 2017 is, 2 years in. But even with 2 years in, they're on a foothill soil. It's very iron rich. It's not naturally high in organic matter. And it's really hot and it's really dry up there. And just in 2 years, I mean, just look at some of the differences in the microbial biomass. And it continues to be high and go up. In 2019, the numbers were just incredible. And, we really chalk this up to these guys are so serious about, getting every efficiency they can, both in terms of the inputs they're putting in. They're trying to make as much of their own compost as they can. They have extremely efficient irrigation systems. And most importantly, they're constantly growing. There's constantly things in the ground. And that means there's constantly food for these microbes. And the next thing I wanted to go on to is just to kind of give you an idea of total carbon. So just a little background. Total carbon is, in the cases of these farms, can also be equated with organic carbon. We actually did both tests and they came out the same. So again, this total carbon number is over half of organic matter. It's about 50% of organic matter. So in your head, if you're thinking about like, oh, what's the organic matter number? You're going to see some really interesting numbers here. So again, starting with Singing Frogs Farm, who's our model farm, they've been doing this for over 10 years. These are the highest organic matters I've ever seen in my life. So some would dispute, well, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? We're not going to get into that. But the productivity they have is incredible. They clearly have pest resilience. They clearly have drought resilience. And so in 2018, we saw total carbon percentages almost up to 9. That means you're looking at organic matter of around 20, right? And this is a lot of data that's in these figures. 2019, again, it was a little bit lower. That might have just been the time of year, well, same time of year, but it might have just been differences in irrigation, what the last crop was, different things like that. But still, even at 6%, that's incredibly high. That's a 12% organic matter level. And again, the control, which is nothing to scoff at, is a perennial grassland. And it's not low. I mean, that's what we see in our California native soils in that area. It's not particularly low, but compared to what Singing Frogs is seeing on their farm, it's a big difference. And so kind of before I get into these other farms, I'm actually going to jump ahead and tell you what I'm most excited about in these figures is if you look at Singing Frogs, there's 3 depths here. So as I mentioned, we're sampling down to 60 centimeters, which is about 2 feet. So again, increasing your organic matter in the top 6 inches, not that hard. You can do that with a bunch of different stuff. Seeing that carbon actually move down into the soil, into that middle profile between 15 centimeters and 30, which is between 6 inches and 12, that's below most root zones. And that's where we really see the dissolved organic carbon is moving down through the soil profile. And we even see levels that are slightly higher. We haven't run significance on those yet, but we even see it going down. And that's where the no-till factor comes in, right? Because that carbon isn't being turned back to the top and being exposed to the surface. And I'll just run through these real quick. I'm lingering because I'm a nerd, but again, Soil-Borne Farms is the farm in Sacramento we're working with. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. But Hillview Farms, another farm that is doing really well on this front. Unfortunately, they're doing so well that they planted their control field into no-till, so we no longer have a control, but that's why that's missing in 2019. A marker of success if there ever was one. But again, really high numbers and even increases that we see in the middle profile there.
All right, so when we look at this data, we know that it's very important and it can uncover some things that we might not otherwise understand, but I think it's also really important to just look at a larger context and at the human element here, that if we're just looking at data, we might miss the bigger picture, basically. So along the way throughout this project, we have been in constant contact and communication with these farmers, and really we've been trying to understand and learn what some of their challenges have been, maybe how they've adapted to them, what their successes have been as well. And so I think this really just goes to show that the process is really just as important as the data. So one way that we have been learning from these farms and been facilitating knowledge sharing between farmers is through this no-till intensive symposium that we hosted with UC Berkeley and Mesa earlier this year. And so we brought together about 25 different farmers from different backgrounds. They were some of them rural farmers, some of them urban farmers, and really just had a discussion around these practices as well as what they're learning and helping, identifying some of the needs as well for resources. And there was really a consensus among them that especially there is a need for more opportunities for farmer-to-farmer learning around these practices. So that's something that we're going to be looking at as we move forward. Also, in terms of just facilitating farmer-to-farmer exchange, that's going to be a priority for us in the future as well. So also when we're looking at these systems, seeing that they are really quite labor intensive, any way that you can maximize efficiency really pays off in the long term. So for example, in the case of Hillview Farms, which is the one that's in the foothills, we saw that they were able to innovate and adapt in a couple of different ways. And so one of them was that when they were an urban farm, they had differing bed lengths. And so that was kind of a challenge for them in terms of just crop planning. And since they've been able to procure another piece of land, they have really been able to redesign the farm in a way to maximize these efficiencies. So for example, they now have a standard bed length that's just 100 feet. So this is a really simple thing, but it makes a big difference for them in terms of crop planning and rotations as well. And then also at Hillview, we see that they grow in both the field, of course, but also in hoop houses. So they're really able to take advantage of both of these settings and also extend the growing season. And Hillview also is going to be incorporating cover crops more. It's something they've kind of played around with, but this next year they're really going to be integrating cover crops more regularly and even doing a summer cover crop. And then also for all of these farms, having a robust greenhouse program has been really important, and it's something that has required evaluation and some changes along the way, but for them it's been a very important tool to maximize these efficiencies. So in the future, our next steps for this program, or this project rather, as Sara mentioned, are that next year we're going to be taking one more year of soils data so that we can finalize that data and analyze it and see if there's any other trends or correlations that we can find there. And then we're also going to be developing some case studies around each of these farms. So basically that will look like just doing more in-depth interviews with these farmers and really trying to glean what they've learned from their experiences and document their valuable knowledge so that it can be passed on not only to the public but also to other farmers, really along with the science behind these practices as well. And in addition to this, we're also going to be pursuing some other research and education opportunities. So for example, pretty soon we're going to be partnering with UC Berkeley and Mesa on a grant proposal so that we can build upon this project and also directly address some of the questions that the farmers at our No-till symposium had identified as being really important, some of these research questions. And then also as a part of that grant proposal, we're going to be looking at building up these farmer-to-farmer networks so that we can have more resources for farmers and really facilitate farmer-to-farmer learning.
And I always like to end on this slide, and I think you guys, I'm preaching to the choir here, I know, but I really think it's so important, and I hear this from farmers over and over again when they have positive interactions with their consumers, with the people that are eating the food that they're growing, that it is so encouraging to them that those people care about what they're doing and they care about that they're stewards of the land. And so, I really think that if we're going to achieve this enhanced productivity and resilience, enhanced conservation, and really get serious about climate mitigation adaptation, there has to be stronger relationships between consumers and farmers. And so this is just an encouragement to all of you guys to keep doing what you're doing in terms of engaging with the farming community and having those really important conversations. And with that, I think we'll take a moment to thank our sponsors, our funders here. We've been supported by a lot of really great groups of people. And I think we'll say thank you and take questions. Yeah, absolutely. So first I would say it depends on the soil you have. So if you're in the Bay Area, you probably have a good amount of clay in your soil. Maybe, yeah. So all of these farms, including Singing Frogs, started with some soil disturbance. So they started with broad forking every season. They've moved away from that over time. Other folks like Hillview Farms, they have a lot more clay in their soil. So they're actually working a tiny bit of the soil because they actually get a lot of soil crusting just because of the mineral soil content they have. Other folks in the Bay Area that we've worked with in the past have, it's an uphill battle to go full no-till in a heavy clay soil. Obviously, the more organic material you can add through compost, mulch, anything like that, growing cover crops is a great way to break up soil, especially ones that have tap roots like brassicas that'll get down there. Tillage radish is an amazing cover crop. But I would say that I should have mentioned this earlier, but we're not here to shame tillage at all. We work with a lot of different farmers and a lot of them till, and this is one system we look at. But I would say if you're having trouble, especially with infiltration into that deeper level, I would, a little bit of soil disturbance is okay. And I would say, just no recreational tillage. Till with moderation, so. Oh yeah, so so that's, it's a very different system, right? So that's where you're going down deep and you're really setting up your soil profile in a totally different way. I would say apples and oranges, honestly. This system works really well on lighter soils and can work well on heavier soils. I would say the John Jevett, from what I've heard, I'm not an expert in it at all, from what I've heard, that's really useful in heavy clay soils. They've had huge success with those kinds of systems in different areas of Africa where they have incredibly heavy clays. And, if you're going to go no-till, you wouldn't even be able to put your finger in the soil, much less plant a plant in there. So I would say it's situational, but it's also, I think, up to the farmer's philosophy, to be totally honest. So, yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question, one we kick around a lot, actually. So I would say, my opinion is that I would very much like everyone to all agree on a name. Considering we're human beings, I don't know that the chances of that are great. And I think the reasons for that are somewhat arbitrary, to tell you the truth, because, our program was named Climate Smart Farming because we knew that California, the state government, was going to adopt that kind of terminology, and we wanted to say, hey, we're an on-the-ground program and we're doing it and we support you and we want to better make your work more effective. But along the way, carbon farming has already been established. No one's going to change that name. Regenerative farming is looking at labels. So, I think in the end, as long as all of these organizations are actually collaborating, which we are, we work with people who do carbon farms, we work on regenerative ag projects. At the end of the day, it's all the same practices. And if 10 years ago, we all would have gotten together and said, hey, all of these organizations are visionaries and they're all going to work in this space, let's agree on a name now, then we should have done it then. And I don't know if now it's going to happen. I think it's going to stick around, and as long as we keep educating people on the similarities and differences when they are there, I think it's honestly a great conversation entry. So, yeah. Yes, apologies. I usually have it up here. We'll give you a card at the end if that's helpful, but if you want a really easy one, it's Sara at CAFF, S-A-R-A, at CAFF.org. Or you can, you can Google Community Alliance with Family Farmers, CAFF.org. Yeah, that's our organization. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, so we haven't collected quantification on that. Most of it has been through documenting that through the farmers. The reason being is that these guys are such diversified vegetable farms that it's every time we go out and sample, there's a different kind of crop in the ground and it's a different growth stage than the previous year. So it would have just been too many variables in the data set, but we do a ton of documentation on what the planting density is like, what their yields are like, what they're seeing. And I think the take home that we've gotten is that there's just an incredible amount of produce coming off of these fields. One example, just an anecdote, Hillview Farms, which is the one in Lincoln, California, last year they grossed $180,000 on less than an acre of land. So that tells you something about the crop density and just how much food they're able to produce on a very small, between 3/4 of an acre and an acre of land. But that's definitely something, so I should say in the research proposal that we're working on with UC Berkeley, that doing some more crop data is in that proposal. Yeah. Right.
There's longer range data that is either measurable or not measurable, more of a value type consideration, like joy and habitat, measure that, right? And like this morning, Robert Kennedy Jr. was talking about the joy of seeing, the bees and the butterflies that he saw in his childhood. I mean, that was a major thing for him. And I'd like to think it's a major thing for him. So I'd like to have you, really open.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I think those are some of the things we really want to highlight in the case studies we do, which are really going to be comprehensive stories, right, about what the farmers have seen and what we've seen, mostly what the farmers have seen, including all of those. I think at the end of the day, the most important things are immeasurable. So I think that calling those out, and you can do it in a lot of ways with singing frogs. You can do it with pictures. I mean, if you've ever been on their farm, it's incredible. It's like being in a botanical garden. There's predators coming on. There's beneficial insects everywhere. Sorry, yeah. So maybe we'll converse afterwards. I think we're out of time here. So thank you guys all for coming. Please come talk to us if you're interested. Thanks.